Welcome to It's Your Move, a show that may challenge the way you view persons with disabilities. We are a production of Westchester Independent Living Center, a disability rights advocacy organization here in White Plains at 10 County Center Road. I'm Lisa Tarracone. My guest tonight is Fran Wishnick. Fran has written a profoundly moving book about her son Craig, who at the age of 27 ended his own life after a lifetime struggle with Asperger syndrome and mental illness. Fran uses her book to raise awareness and generate understanding about her son's personhood as an individual dealing with the challenges of mental illness, and also to advocate for person-centered care in our fractured mental health system. Welcome, Fran.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Fran, this book is not only beautifully written, but it's deeply honest and provides a tremendous insight into Craig's day-to-day perseverance. It also speaks to the inadequacy of the various support systems that were really unable to help him during his time of need. It must have been very difficult for you to reconstruct your son's life through this book. Maybe you can tell us about that process and what was the decision that you came to write this book, Craig Climbed a Tree. I'm sorry, I don't think I introduced your book. Craig Climbed a Tree at the outset of the show, and we'll also show that book later. So at the end of the show.
Thanks. Yes, about 3 months after our son took his life, I actually began writing this book, and I had never written a book. I didn't consider myself a writer, but what I knew a couple things. One is that I had some incredible writings from him that I really needed to share with the world, and I knew that it would help me in processing my grief, but in addition, and really the main reason I decided to write it was because I felt that people in the education fields, in the mental health fields, and families needed to understand more about the struggles, but also the strengths that a person can have and what that looks like in real time. So I just decided I had to write this. It took me 5 years. There were periods of time when I couldn't think of how to go forward.
Of course.
And wasn't even sure I could do it. And then suddenly I would write the next chapter.
Sure.
So it was really a process.
So this book actually is written by you and Craig, as you
Yes.
mentioned on the cover of the book, and it's an entwinement basically of Craig's writings, pardon me, in his email, his journal notes, and then your thoughts and your relationship with him. So
Right.
you had to reevaluate all of that and revisit all of that.
I had to reread his writings many times. That was very tearful, but also a lot of smiles,
Sure.
and made me realize once again how intuitive he was and smart in his own way, a very different kind of way, and how hard he tried to survive.
Sure.
And how difficult it was for him. So I knew all those things on some level, and then rereading them put another put it to a whole new level for me.
Absolutely. Craig was remarkably complex in his intellectual acumen, deeply sensitive and caring young man as well. And I'm going to read an excerpt from this book. I think that when I read the book twice, and what I was really struck with was not only the level of his deep sensitivity and his sensibilities and careful assessment of every aspect of his life, but his need to be understood, which was profound. And I think that's what really the huge struggle for him in dealing with Asperger's and his mental illness was just having people perceive him as he was and having them really understand who he was. Something he wrote, which I'm going to read, Craig's words: "One of the hardest things in life is to prove who you are. It doesn't have to be convincing, just to be convincing yourself, which is important, but other expectations have to follow. And all these rules and guidelines to almost anything that happens. I feel that along with satisfying everybody else by doing this, there is additional pressure to exceed what others expect." And that is something that comes through in this book over and over again. that struggle for him to survive, to be understood?
It was a struggle for him to be understood, and it was a struggle for him to understand our world.
Right.
And so, as you read about his life, you see how much he questions just about everything.
Sure.
And really didn't understand how people think in general. People who are called neurotypicals, which is supposed to be the average person.
Right.
How we think about things. He couldn't get it. And so and he tried really hard. The more he didn't understand, the more he tried to understand.
Right. Well, you mentioned alien worlds, right? His perception of the world and how it felt alien to him, which was very real. And
It did. I remember when he was fairly young, and we lived in Maryland at the time, and we drove through a part of Baltimore where there was a lot of poverty and homelessness. And he turned to me while I was driving, and he said, what are you going to do about it? And I had to explain to him that even though I was involved in many different causes, that there wasn't something I could stop and do that would really alter things. And he just could not understand how people could be in that position where you understand something and you don't do anything.
right. Well, you shared something with me prior to the show, if I may, about your husband. You had asked your husband. What was the comment?
He asked my husband Ken, what made you become a capitalist? And he asked him that question because Ken was trying to describe to him what it was like when he was in college and he was protesting and doing and really questioning the way things were. And then from Craig's perception, he jumped, that my husband jumped from that to being a normal person accepting of the world. And it's sort of funny because I don't think Ken ever really did become a capitalist, but that was Craig's perception. Was he very much took things black and white, and so you really in general were either this or that, and he just saw things in a very literal way. I give an example from when he was a young child and someone spit in a stream, and our family is very environmentally conscious, but certainly spitting in a stream is not a major violation. He came home crying because he said that it would poison the fish and the frogs, and that was and I had to spend a lot of time, trying to calm him down and explaining that there were degrees of things.
Right. So, again, reading the book, I was struck by how principled he is, strong sense of ethics. He in the book, it talks about, you talk about his, I think he's 5 years old, very young, on a camping trip, I believe, and he went fishing, and he caught a fish. He was very excited about that. And then later that evening, you were serving that fish that he caught for dinner, and he was horrified that the fish had to die in order for him to eat. And at that, he didn't eat the fish that night, but he became a vegetarian and stayed a vegetarian for the rest of his life because he didn't, the idea of harming animals or killing animals for human consumption was not something he wanted to participate in.
That's absolutely true, and I should say that the day before he ate 4 McDonald's hamburgers, but once he made that decision, once he understood the connection between catching that fish that was alive and then the idea of eating it, he would never go back and never wavered from that position.
Yeah, and you said you and your husband are now vegetarians.
We are.
And you also shared with me before the show that that Craig has altered your thinking, your sensibilities, and how you view things.
In so many ways. It's interesting because parents are supposed to be teaching their children, and I'm sure that we did teach him things, but he taught us so much about how the human brain works, what happens when we accept things without questioning. For example, in the book I talk about how he never understood the saying, you're comparing apples and oranges.
Right, yeah.
Because to him, of course you can compare apples and oranges. They both grow on trees, they're both fruits, so why would you say something like that? And I had to say to him, well, it's a saying. Well, that's stupid.
Right.
That's what he thought.
Exactly. I know when he was in later in the book, as he's making his way through college, and he lived in New York City for a while, he, again, having difficulty connecting with folks, with people, wanting to be understood, feeling on the outside of most social interaction, he takes out an ad runs an ad in the classifieds, and he very articulate, looking for a companionship, looking for a friend that he can speak with, share movies with, and very clear about what he doesn't want. He did find one friend, I think Allie, I believe her name was, that he was able to sustain a relationship with through most of his life, but had difficulty with that process as well, in either getting a response to that ad or being able to interact with people in a long term, including some roommates.
Yes, because long term, and it came on sooner than later. Craig would be very intense.
Yeah.
And he was intense with us, but we were his parents, and we knew him, and we could accept that, even though some days were really hard. But with friends or other people, he would question. You look sad. You look stressed. Talk to me about that. And people don't necessarily want to have those kinds of conversations, especially when they don't know you that well.
Sure.
So he questions everything.
Right. And again, I mean, I know that people just generally feel uncomfortable with intensity.
Yes.
If I'm talking with my friends and I get too intense, it's like that's sort of, or introversion. People who are introverts are given not as much, or not as valued, I don't think, in our culture as extroverts. So if you're perceived as being introvert, too intense, questioning, or even too much of a purist about things, it's not as valued. And for Craig, that was magnified greatly. Craig was finally diagnosed at the age of 15. That was a long time to sort of make his way through life, and as a family as well, without knowing of having a firm diagnosis. Once he received that diagnosis of Asperger syndrome, how did that affect your family and Craig, if at all?
It affected us, but not as much as you might think, in that it affected us in that we had a name for some of the things that we were seeing. But Craig was never fit neatly into categories. So part of the reason he wasn't diagnosed until he was a teenager is because he wasn't a classic Asperger's. And it's interesting because that whole thing is a spectrum of symptoms or behaviors.
Maybe you can describe a little bit about the spectrum, the autism.
So generally, people with Asperger's tend to have problems with socialization. A lot of times there's sensory overload. For example, touch or smell or noises really can affect people, and for Craig that was absolutely true. But one of the other characteristics, the general characteristic that doctors are looking for, has to do with problems with executive functioning. And what that means is, going around, if you were walking around White Plains and you needed to get from here to there, and someone had explained to you or you had seen a map, most people could do that fairly well. But usually a person with Asperger's needs a lot of help with that. That was never a problem for Craig. In fact, he sort of excelled at it. And so because he didn't have that problem, he didn't neatly fit into it. But generally, the Asperger's piece has to do with socialization, sensory, and a lot of times people who fixate on certain expertise areas. Like I'll never forget, this is not Craig's thing, but someone who fixated on vacuum cleaners and knew everything about them, was an expert.
He was a different kind of expert. I mean, I'm going to read another quote because he had a way, and I think this is maybe, I'll call it a purist way of thinking. We talked before about, you go through life and you're sort of corrupted into behaving certain ways and thinking certain ways. Your sensibilities shift and change. Your curiosity shifts into something different as you become older. You respond more to social cues. And I think Craig, was a very, he was his own thinker in so many different ways. And something else that he a remark he made was quite remarkable. He, I think, was one of the many psychiatrists he was going to see, and he was not very looking forward to it. He didn't feel that the psychiatrists were really respecting him or understanding him. They were too quick to diagnose without looking at him as who he was as a person. And he says, do not be hypnotized by a well-worded mission statement or beautiful scenery at a facility. In addition, when you meet a friendly staff person, that individual is frequently not reflective of the overall staff at the facility. Instead, when making a decision, look at the core of that place and see what it really offers. Ask yourself, how does this place deviate from the others that I've read about or visited? How many times do we stop and think about things like that? That's wonderful.
And this was his advice to us.
Yeah,
and when
great
I saw
advice.
that, I had to laugh.
Great
Because,
advice.
of course, he was right.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. When you step back and think, why am I doing this? I mean, so many of us, coast through life, maybe we take jobs that maybe we don't want. We don't really look deeply enough at things. But that, again, was the rub for him throughout his life, unfortunately. I mean, he excelled. I mean, he won an award. I forget the name of the award he won in science. It was in the book that he won.
Oh, social studies. Yeah.
And just, again, extremely bright, intellectual capacity, very astute, but wasn't able to apply that. He wasn't able to really fit in.
Yeah, one of the things that I talk about when I go around doing presentations, and I've thought a lot about the lessons of Craig's book. One of the things is that Craig never fit a label. He was so complex,
Right.
and that's part of what you really get out of the book is the complexity of this young man. So he was very complex, and he kept trying to label things in order to understand them. So at the same time that the world was labeling him
Yeah, great.
wrongly, he had to, for his own understanding, almost over-label things.
Absolutely. Well, you did a presentation at Marist College in this past February, and I was looking over the notes, the takeaways from that presentation, and overall, and these were for students, social work students and nursing, I think you said? Education students. And the takeaway, and there were quite a few, and you're still getting some responses, you said, right? Were to respect and try to understand their patients more and their students more. To listen when they say they don't understand, to look at them beyond the diagnosis, and to look at them as a person. And that's, again, what Craig was missing. And I guess with the various supports that you were looking for, I mean, we'll talk a little bit about that now, the mental health system, he was not able to get the help he needed. The siloed effect, falling through the cracks, in trying to fix a diagnosis, he was not able to get the help that he needed.
So
They weren't looking at him as person-centered care is not very available.
this is so important to everybody going forward, is that, and I really, in the case of Marist, wanted to get to students before they entered their
Absolutely.
careers. So before they were caught up in the rules and regulations and diagnostic classifications of their professions, I was hoping that they would take a really close look at what it means to really think of a person and work in a person-centered way. So what is person-centered care? It's really getting a deep understanding of how a person perceives things and the complexities, and of course all the physical manifestations, and it's complex but necessary in order to work with the person, whether it's in school or in medicine, wherever. Craig fell between the cracks in several ways. One was he definitely suffered from depression, lifelong depression, and as you read in the book, he also had suicidal ideations, which is suicidal thoughts. So he was in the mental health system. But then there's another system, and each of these is funded separately, and it's called a silo. So in New York State, for example, we have the Office of Mental Health, and then we have the Office of People with Developmental Disabilities. And a developmental disability can well include Asperger's or a form of autism, but Craig could not be treated in that system because he was too functional, because he could count money and take care of himself, and to a great extent. Yet he really needed the mix of the services that were offered, because he did need help with socialization, and he did need help with a job. He desperately wanted to work. Yeah, he did graduate college.
Yeah.
We didn't mention this, summa cum laude,
Yes, yes.
which was extraordinary.
Absolutely.
But he could never work because a job really had to be tailored to his needs for understanding things, and his needs for understanding assignments, and also the interrelationships of the workers. He could have benefited greatly from services that are offered in the Office of Developmental Disabilities, which I have to say is a rich system. In other words, there's much more money available in that system than there is in mental health. So for a lot of reasons, Craig didn't get the mix of services that he as an individual needed, but was looked more from the perspective of, okay, well, this is our system and this is our other system, and you meet this one and you don't meet this one. Even within the mental health system, there wasn't a mix of services for the part of him that had the suicidal ideations.
Right.
You know, even nowadays, when we talk about zero suicide, there's much more attention paid to the people who are acutely suicidal. In other words, it comes on suddenly or is intense for a period of time, but is generally not there. And Craig needed certain services that just weren't available. I advocate a lot for a change in how we provide services.
How do you see that moving?
With difficulty,
Yeah.
because our systems are under a lot of stress right now, and it's
Absolutely.
really unclear what's going to happen. So, on the federal level and on the state level, but a couple of things is that, we really should work hard to, if not eliminate these silos, at least have them work hand in hand for the person, with person-centered care. The other thing is that, for example, in mental health, we have something called the ACT team, assertive community treatment, and if a person meets the criteria, ACT workers will go to their house, and there's certain level of intensity. Well, Craig didn't quite meet those requirements either, but yet he needed certain services pretty much on a daily basis, at least to stabilize him, and that wasn't available. So I'm advocating for that as well. There are many positive changes that we could be making in our systems of care if we really stop and focus on what person-centered means.
Well, there's a lot more. That is now a term that's being used a lot more in advocacy right now, and it is infiltrating all types of service deliveries, and the work that you're doing, that other advocates are doing. Grassroots advocacy is huge in this regard. The other issue I think that we can touch briefly is just the whole medication. I know that Craig struggled tremendously with that. The different various types of medications that were prescribed for him, and some of the side effects with those medications, trying to transition off of them, and then experiencing some tolerance, having to deal with the tolerance levels and then the side effects.
Yeah, so that the whole medication issue is very complex, because for Craig, he had the depression, he had anxiety, and he also had, unfortunately, immune system problems. Right. And the last one was the ulcerative colitis. So he was on pretty heavy-duty medications for the ulcerative colitis, and those undoubtedly had effects. And then the depression and anxiety, a lot of those anxiety medications are really not meant to be long-term.
Right.
And in fact, they change the brain patterns, and there's some fears of epilepsy and other things coming from them. So there's a lot of warnings about not taking them long term, and Craig was fully aware of those warnings. He read the warnings. Yeah. Actually, like many people with Asperger's do, they read the prescription inserts intensely.
Sure. Absolutely. Well, he also did a lot of things on his own. I mean, he talks about aromatherapy in the book. You talk about that. He would take scented oils and take baths to sort of calm himself. Different types of color. He was an avid, he loved music. Animals gave him extreme pleasure as well. So I think that he did a lot of his own self-advocacy in trying to address some of these issues without the medication.
And one of the really important points is that, again, understanding the person, Craig, more than once, went to doctors and he said, you know, I didn't feel this way, but you know, in the last few weeks I've been feeling increasingly depressed or increasingly anxious. And the doctors would say to him, use your coping mechanisms. And he wrote about this, and I put it in the book because it's so real. You know, I remember the times where he said, how could they say that to me? They didn't even stop and ask me if I have been using them and what I've been using.
Absolutely.
And in fact, we know how many he said, how many baths can a person take?
Right.
And we know how he listened to music and did all these different things. But when the depression and anxiety reached a certain level, those things didn't work. The doctors would also say, think positively.
Right.
As if we can snap
out
our
of it.
fingers and just...
It's just a lack of understanding, a lack of respect, and it's a huge disservice. We have about a minute left, Fran. Any last thoughts you'd like to say in a minute that we have? And also just if someone wants to contact you, because you do, as we mentioned at the outset of the show, that you utilize the book and you do presentations to various civic groups and hospitals and schools. So how can someone get in touch with you?
So my email is Fran, is my name, fran.wishnick@gmail.com. So that's fran.wishnick@gmail.com. And I would welcome the opportunity to do presentations because I think it's really important to get inside the family story, you know, and especially Craig's story, to understand the life of a person with great complexities. I would also add that, of course, it greatly affected our family, but I tried very hard to make the book about him.
Absolutely. Well, again, the book is Craig Climbed a Tree. Thank you so much, Fran,
Thank
and
you.
we'll see you next time. Take care.